Can everybody hear me?
We can, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for the nodding and words. Okay, and I can see Mr. Lewis and Mr. Cosgrove, and yeah, okay. So thank you, and Mr. Yarwood we have here as well. Okay, so I shall resume this inquiry into the appeal made by William Davies Limited under Section 78 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 against the decision of Derbyshire Dales District Council to refuse planning permission for a hybrid planning application accompanied by an environmental statement comprising of an outline planning application with approval being sought for site access for up to 345 residential units, Class E commercial uses including retail and a restaurant, cafe, a hot food takeaway, sway generous use, and open space, including a countryside park and play area, and associated landscaping and surface water attenuation, and a full planning application for 78 residential units with associated access, open space, landscaping and surface water attenuation at land at Gritstone Road and Pinewood Road, Matlock, DE4 3GD. It's hard to believe, but this is the 6th day of the inquiry. The inquiry was opened in March this year. Following opening statements in March, we heard from a number of interested parties. Mr. Yarwood for the Rule 6 party, the Wolds Action Group, was cross-examined, and we heard the evidence of Mr. Hilton, Mr. Fraser, Mr. Webber, Mr. Cassie and Mr. Dickinson for the appellant. There was also a discussion on draft conditions and planning obligations, and the site visit took place on the Friday morning of week 1 of the inquiry. Today, first of all, I expect to hear from Mr. Ashby, an interested party who's not yet had the opportunity to speak at the inquiry. Following Mr. Ashby, we will move on to cross-examination on the sequential test. And since the inquiry last sat, several documents have been produced by the parties in respect to the sequential test, and the most recent documents are ID 33 to ID 36, which are on the inquiry document area of the council's inquiry website. After hearing from Mr. Yarwood for the Wolds Action Group and Mr. Pendle for the appellant on the sequential test, we will move on to the final cross-examination of Mr. Yarwood and Mr. Dickinson on planning. And after that, I would like to hold a hopefully brief round-table discussion on conditions and obligations to address any remaining issues. I would be grateful if you could make sure that your mobile phones or other devices that you're not using for the inquiry today are on silent or switched off. And as today's event is virtual, please could you ensure that you're muted and that you place your hand up if you wish to speak. So just a few housekeeping matters up front. I've already mentioned a couple of inquiry documents, but I've circulated an updated list of the inquiry documents, and the council has helpfully uploaded those onto their website. Thank you very much. I've also sent an updated list of conditions to the 3 main parties, having received an updated list of conditions, and the slightly cleaner version of conditions which I sent back is ID 42. I have a copy of the latest version of the legal agreement, which is ID 38, and 2 associated plans with that. Can I just check with the parties before we discuss any other procedural or housekeeping matters, where matters are with any costs applications, please? Mr. Yarwood, can I ask, first of all, whether the Wolds Action Group intends to pursue any costs applications?
No.
Thank you. And the council?
Morning, madam. No, we don't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cosgrove. And the appellant, Mr. Lewis?
We have no intention, madam. Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's helpful. Okay, so are there any procedural or housekeeping matters that anybody wishes to raise before we move on to hearing from Mr. Ashby? And if I can ask Mr. Yarwood, first of all, for the Wolds Action Group.
Just one slight issue I might have to raise. I have been suffering from nosebleeds over the last 2 days. I'm hoping it won't occur today, but if it does, I apologise in advance. It won't distract me too much, but it might distract other people.
Okay, well, thank you for telling us, and if that does occur, we'll take a break as and when needed so that you can have a chance to recover and regroup. Okay, I'm sure everybody can be understanding of that. With the weather, it probably isn't helping. Okay, thank you. Nothing further though, Mr. Yarwood.
No, nothing.
Great, thank you. Anything from the council procedurally or on housekeeping matters?
No, thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. And anything from the appellant, Mr. Lewis?
Nothing from us, Madam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So, Mr. Ashby, I note you're already here in the inquiry. Thank you very much. And you haven't had the opportunity to speak yet. Are you happy to answer questions on your statement and be cross-examined if the appellant's barrister wishes to do so?
Yes, Madam.
Okay, thank you.
Just one point I need to make is the statement I wrote was in mid-March, and so the things I raise and say are date stamped, if you like, at that time, and are not not an inhabitant of Treetops or anything like that to know where matters stand there.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Would you like to speak, please?
Yeah. I've closely followed the planning inquiry when available on YouTube and Teams. Would like to add the following. Firstly, the appellant seems very interested in academic qualifications of the Rule 6 party and other individual objectors, even though its own obedience to the standards it set others was variable for its own experts. I'm a retired chemical engineer to BSc honours level at Birmingham University and retired from the water industry after 23 years as an FCIWEM, Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management. This has CEng chartered status. I have been a resident of the likely most affected part of Gritstone Road for 40 years, and so a successful appeal will have an awful impact on my life for my remaining years, and up to nine years it could be. I am disheartened that there is no application of the Blue Peter approach. Look at one I made earlier to the appellant's previous estate, Treetops, by the district council or the appeal process. If I were a tradesman applying for council trusted trader status, I would have to supply references and have no outstanding faults with those that had not been cleared up. The excellent statements provided by councillors Wayne and Linthwaite and others contain serious warnings that a 90-home estate constructed by the appellant in recent years has 2 drainage suds. Only one functions as planned, the other doesn't fill, even in the rainiest of weather. Sadly, we haven't had a decent fall of rain to sort of verify whether things have changed. Fortunately, the excavated construction method of these in comparison to the largely impounding construction method for those plans on the Wold site does not present a likely risk to life. The limitations of the sewers under the Treetops estate, apparently still not adopted by Severn Trent Water, and the failure of one of the suds has caused foul water flooding to the convent and county schools that never experienced it prior to the estate's construction. The new fire station will be tested the next time serious rainfall occurs, along with other downstream properties. Repeated high rainfall events following closely together will mean that the suds cannot slow the second onslaught and will be overtopped at some point, as has been shown by objectors that there is no capacity in the sewer system for the excess. I don't know whether Severn Trent plans to follow up their drilling in the town square and to put tanks to cope with that. The excess will head both into Bentley Brook, see below, and to Crown Square in Matlock, flooding shops and dwellings. The benefits of the excellent Bentley Brook pumping station and Matlock Bridge flood alleviation schemes, costing millions, will have been undermined by an unwanted estate. Much of that unplanned excess water impacts the Bentley Brook pumping station, which has no spare capacity and has only just coped in our recent worsening climate. Rapidly worsening climate. There is no Section 106 money available for extra pumps, even if there was space for them. There will not likely be any affordable homes on the Wolds estate. So what is the point of all the hours of discussion that it took to set 30% target if it was not going to be met, and to justify destroying a greenfield site to generate just builder profits and not meeting a societal need? The Chancellor has allocated £2 billion of scarce public funds to meet this need. Wolds Farm estate sales will thus be for higher earners, and because of Matlock's poor economic situation, will suck in purchasers from further afield. This will mean more traffic and air pollution, confounding current planning objectives. If the appeal is allowed and the completed Wolds SUDs end up with the 50% success rate of treetops, anything less than 100% will mean a very high risk to life and severe flooding in Matlock. The treetop site is 90 homes, and Wolds will be 423. I'm not sure the latest figure. This is a very high risk application from a company with this track record. Earth dams are a tricky thing to get right and require careful, deep geological survey, much more complete than has been carried out by the appellant, as Severn Trent Water found out when the face of the first Carsington Reservoir dam slipped because of inadequate geology, had failed to detect a foundation of the wrong kind of clay. Fairly recent memories of the flooding of Stony Middleton and Whaley Bridge's partial evacuation because of failing earth-wall dams showed the need for a proper inspection and maintenance regime with proper funding. This latter need seems to have been nicely skated over by the appellant. It should be clarified. I might be corrected by latest matters on that. Climate change. This is not going away, and the need for the limited sponge effect of the untouched Wolds farmland has never been greater. And to cover these fields with buildings, tarmac and paving, and to impound some of the water falling on it and running through it, is the height of dangerous folly. Once soil has been broken and construction starts, irreversible damage will have been done to the soil structure. If the appellant gets cold feet financially or finds unexpected problems in the construction of even just phase 1, who will hold feet to the fire to complete enough SUDs to protect Matlock imperfectly? In last year's terrible highly unseasonal flooding in Valencia and then Alicante, mud and water filled houses and cars, which became either death traps or lethal weapons in the onslaught. Imagine what would happen if there was a cascade failure of SUDs to cars and people caught out in the open on Bank Road. In last year's hurricanes, the rain fortunately didn't get as stuck over Matlock as other parts of England, where some A roads were flooded for days. Extreme weather and so-called 1 in 100 years theoretical simulations just don't cut it for such high risk locations as Wolds is becoming, despite LLFA statements. I'm happy to be questioned on these matters.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, do you have any questions of Mr. Ashby at all?
I don't have any questions for Mr. Ashby, Madam. Thank you. We've covered the land drainage issues raised by Mr. Ashby comprehensively when we last met, of course, including the concerns raised by Mr. Ashby about SUDs failing on other sites. And Madam, you'll recall the confirmation I gave that the appellant has no involvement at all with any of those failings on other sites that have been mentioned. I won't go over that ground again, but I thank you, Mr. Ashby, for your contribution, and we'll respond fully in closing to the concerns that have been raised in relation to land drainage matters.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ashby, for your time and your input. I would be very grateful if you could submit your statement that you've just read out to the case officer at the planning inspectorate, Mr. Brown, and then I can circulate it and put it on the inquiry document library as a statement.
Could I just make one more comment? It's twice been on BBC One prime time, a programme called When Cities Flood, dealing with the situation that happened in Spain and the lessons that other countries where you can have a static rainfall causing a huge devastation and death and destruction, obviously on a much bigger scale. It would be well worth anyone watching that program. It's very sobering, describing how cars start to move in 30 inches of water.
Thank you, Mr. Ashby. Anything further, Mr. Lewis?
Nothing further, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, Mr. Ashby, and I hope you enjoy your holiday. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so moving on now to the sequential test evidence. So we're starting with Mr. Yarwood. Mr. Lewis, would you like to cross-examine Mr. Yarwood on the sequential test, please? And Mr. Yarwood, please shout if there's any problems.
Will do, thank you.
Mr. Yarwood, very good morning to you. Good to see you again. In relation to the sequential test, Mr. Yarwood, the documents that we will need for this part of the cross-examination, just in case it's helpful for you to bring them up beforehand. I'm conscious that we're doing this virtually, so clearly, if you need some more time to locate documents as we are going through, please don't hesitate to tell me. But just in case it's helpful, Mr. Yarwood, we will be looking at the appellant's sequential test document. That is ID 26.
Yes.
We will also be looking at the local plan again briefly. That's CD 6.2.
Right.
We'll also be looking at the appellant's response to the inspector's questions on the sequential test. That's ID 33. It's also there as CD 13.6.
Yes.
We'll also look at your response as the Rule 6 party to our answers to the inspector's questions on the sequential test. That's ID 35. Also there is the CD 13.7. Oh, forgive me. No, that's your response to our response to the inspector's questions, which I think is what I said actually. And then to add another layer of complication, we've got our response to your comments on our sequential test, and that is ID 36. Now, one other document, Mr. Yarwood, that I think we'll need to look at briefly is the PPG, the Planning Practice Guidance on Flood Risk and Coastal Change, which I don't think is in the core documents. I don't know if you're able to call it up from another source. If not, don't worry, we can look to see if I can share it on screen perhaps. But do you have access to the PPG on flood risk and coastal change, Mr. Yarwood?
Yes.
You do. I'm most grateful. That means I won't have to share my screen. So could we start, Mr. Yarwood, by looking at policy and guidance, please, in relation to the sequential test? Could you take up the PPG on flood risk and coastal change, and go to the subsection, please, entitled The Sequential Approach to the Location of Development. That starts at the bottom of, well, it depends on the format of the document. If you happen to be using a PDF of the PPG, it should be at the bottom of page 20. Otherwise, it's question and answer in paragraph 23. If you can go to that we'll look at first.
Having said that I had access to the PPG, I realise now that I'm not linked to the internet on the computer on which it's located, so I may have a problem there.
Worry, as I say, one option, if I can check with the inspector, I could share my screen. Madam, I have it in front of me. I would need, I think, the share privilege to be given to me on the Teams call.
Yes, if I can ask the council to make that privilege available to you, because as it's not run by me, I don't have that privilege either.
Thank you.
We're asking that now on our WhatsApp group.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Cosgrove.
Thank you so much.
That's been granted to Mr. Lewis, so he should be able to do that.
Oh, yes,
now.
it has. Right. Let's see if my technical skills hold up. Right. Now, can you see that on screen, Mr. Yarwood?
I can, yes.
Yes, I'm most grateful to you. So, if you look at paragraph 23, please, and this is the sequential approach to the location of development, and the question there in paragraph 23 is, what is the aim of the sequential approach? Can you see that?
Yes, indeed.
And I've highlighted for you some words in yellow, but in fairness to you, let's just remind ourselves of what this particular Q&A says. What is the aim of the sequential approach? The approach is designed to ensure that areas at little or no risk of flooding from any source are developed in preference to areas at higher risk. This means avoiding, so far as possible, development in current and future medium and high risk flood areas, considering all sources of flooding, including areas at risk of surface water flooding. Avoiding flood risk through the sequential test is the most effective way of addressing flood risk because it places the least reliance on measures like flood defences, flood warnings and property level resilience features. Even where a flood risk assessment shows the development can be made safe throughout its lifetime without increasing risk elsewhere, the sequential test still needs to be satisfied. Now, just focus on these words that I've highlighted in yellow, please, if you will. Application of the sequential approach in the plan making and decision making process will help to ensure that development is steered to the lowest risk areas where it is compatible with sustainable development objectives to do so, and developers do not waste resources promoting proposals which would fail to satisfy the test. So what those words in yellow make clear, Mr. Yarwood, I suggest to you, is that, and in particular those words, where it is compatible with sustainable objectives to do so. Those words mean, don't they, that the sequential test isn't an exercise to be carried out in the abstract without any regard at all to other planning considerations, including sustainability, yes?
I agree.
Thank you. Could we then go down, please, to paragraph 27? Let me do that on screen for you. Yes, 27. 27 is the question. How should the sequential test be applied to planning applications? And again, scrolling down to the text in yellow, please. The text before it doesn't really add much to the question that I'm going to ask you now. If you focus on the words in yellow, it says this: for individual planning applications subject to the sequential test, the area to apply the test will be defined by local circumstances relating to the catchment area for the type of development proposed. For some developments, this may be clear, for example, the catchment area for a school. In other areas, it may be identified from other plan policies. So just pause on that if you will. And by all means, if you want to check the rest of what paragraph 27 does, please take the time to do so.
I'm happy with my understanding of that.
I'm most grateful. I'm most grateful. So just focusing on what that paragraph is telling us, there is no suggestion, is there, in that paragraph that when you carry out a sequential test for an individual planning application, that you must always apply it in relation to the entire geographical area of the local planning authority.
I agree.
No suggestion of that. I'm very grateful. What is required instead, according to this guidance, is a planning judgment, isn't it, about what the catchment area should be for the type of development proposed, having regard to, as it's put there, other plan policies, so any other relevant policies about sustainable development in the development plan, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. We can agree, can't we, that one of the relevant development plan policies when identifying the catchment area is the policy that identifies the sustainable settlement hierarchy for the district. Yes, it's a relevant consideration if we're to identify the catchment area by reference to other plan policies, yes?
It has some relevance, yes.
It has some relevance. Okay, we'll agreed on that. And that must be right, mustn't it? It must be right that it has, in your words, some relevance. Because the sequential test is to be carried out, isn't it, as the PPG tells us, in a manner that is, and I quote, compatible with sustainable development objectives, yes?
Yes.
I'm very grateful. I can stop sharing my screen for now. I might need the share privilege once more in a little while, so if I may retain it just for now. But just on this question of the plan policies and what they tell us, and specifically the settlement hierarchy, could you go to CD 6.2, please, which is the council's adopted local plan?
Yes, I've got that.
I'm most grateful. Just opening it up on my screen as well. And then within the local plan, could you go please to page 33? PDF, it matches the hard copy numbering 33, which is where you should find policy S2, the settlement hierarchy. Can you see that?
Yeah, well, I'm just getting there.
Yes, sir. Take your time.
33. Getting there. Yes, right. I'm right.
I'm most grateful. So this will be a familiar page to the inquiry by this stage. This is policy S2, the settlement hierarchy. And if we just read the first paragraph together first, please, before we read the rest of it or look at sections of the rest of it. Proposals for new development will be directed towards the most sustainable locations in accordance with the following settlement hierarchy. This will ensure that development reduces the need to travel and promotes sustainable communities based on the services and facilities that are available in each settlement. The use of previously developed land and buildings will be encouraged. So it's a clear principle, isn't it? Key principle, Mr. Yarwood, of the local plan to, and I quote, direct proposals for new development towards the most sustainable locations in accordance with the strategy that is set out in this policy, yes?
Yes.
Yep. So necessarily you would accept, wouldn't you, that a sequential test carried out in a way that is, in the language of the PPG, compatible with sustainable development objectives, must take account of the fact, mustn't it, that the local plan is seeking to direct new development towards the most sustainable locations, yes?
Yes.
Yep. And then we have the market towns, first tier. This will be familiar to you. And in that first tier, we have 3 settlements, Matlock, Ashbourne and Wirksworth. And
Yes.
policy S2, as you'll see in the paragraph after that heading, describes those settlements as the district's main towns. And I continue, they are the primary focus for growth and development to safeguard and enhance their strategic roles as employment and service centres. They will continue to provide significant levels of jobs and homes, together with supporting community facilities and infrastructure to meet their economic potential in the most sustainable way, consistent with maintaining or enhancing key environmental attributes. So when it comes to acting compatibly with sustainable development objectives, Mr. Yarwood, there's a basis in the local plan, isn't there, for considering Matlock, Ashbourne and Wirksworth together, isn't there? Because they have the same status as first tier market towns in policy S2, yes?
Well, not entirely. I mean, we're mixing 2 things up, I think, here. They're the most sustainable towns, actually. That I disagree with the fundamental issue there, because I think Darley-Dale is equally sustainable. But the issue here is twofold. One is you've got to look at the relevant catchment, as well as the hierarchy. And if you look primarily at catchment, then as you have yourself said, that's not necessarily the whole of the district. I would argue that if you're looking at catchment relative to this application site, then that catchment doesn't really include Ashbourne at all. It may include Wirksworth. It certainly includes Darley-Dale. And since Darley-Dale is the next most sustainable location, indeed, it's more sustainable in many ways than the application site, then primarily the catchment is the starting point. And if that's the starting point, then you look not only at the first tier, but at the next most sustainable area, which is Darley-Dale. In fact, as I said before, Darley-Dale is perhaps more sustainable, certainly more sustainable than the application site. And in many ways, since it has the main employment locations for the district, it's one of the, it should really be in the highest hierarchy. I accept it's not, and therefore one has to give weight to the local plan. But since it's in the next highest category, then you would certainly include Darley-Dale in the catchment and look to Darley-Dale as well as Matlock and Wirksworth.
We'll come back to look at Darley-Dale specifically imminently. But towards the end of that answer, I think we got a fair acceptance by you, Mr. Yarwood, that we've got to deal with the local plan, not as we would on the basis of what we would like it to say or wish it to say. We've got to approach the local plan on the basis that this is a local plan that has been through a thorough examination process. Arguments will have been made about where in the settlement hierarchy various settlements should be placed, and the considered judgment of the council, as then endorsed as sound by a local plan inspector, was that it was only Matlock, Ashbourne and Wirksworth that should be put in this first tier in the settlement hierarchy, and that Darley-Dale was in a tier below it, yes?
Yes, on its own in a tier below it as probably unique in that sense, yes.
Yeah, that's a fair observation. And as I say, we'll come on to look at specifically the provision that the plan makes for Darley-Dale in due course relative to these market towns. But focus again, if you will, on the question that I put to you, which was specifically about the logic in this local plan of dealing with these 3 market towns together. There isn't there, a logic embedded in the local plan of dealing with these 3 first tier settlements collectively, because the local plan gives them the same status in that first tier, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And just to pick up on something else that you say, when you say, well, you've got to look at the catchment, what we mean by the catchment for the purposes of the PPG is the word that the PPG uses. But what we really mean by catchment for the purposes of the application of the sequential test is really trying to identify, isn't it, a reasonable area of search for other potentially reasonably available sites, yes?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So when we are seeking to identify that catchment, or as I put it, a reasonable area of search for the application of the sequential test, it is relevant, isn't it, to have regard to this settlement hierarchy and the logic embedded in this settlement hierarchy of dealing with Matlock, Ashbourne and Warkworth as three settlements within their own tier, indeed the top tier, yes?
It's a hierarchy, yes, and they're at the top of the hierarchy, and Darley-Dale's next in terms of the hierarchy, yes. So you look primarily at the catchment, which is available, the sites which are available in what we'll call the catchment, the Matlock area. The first thing you look at is sites in Matlock. Beyond that, you'd look at next at sites in Darley-Dale. That would be the way of approaching a hierarchy of settlements.
We disagree with that, as you know, because as we'll come on to explore, one of the fundamental questions here, of course, relates to what is a reasonable area of search for a development proposal of the scale that is being applied for in this application, and what are the other areas within the district that it is reasonable and logical to take into account when we're looking for reasonably available sites for a proposal of that scale. But let's deal head on with the point that you raise in relation to Darley-Dale, because your point, as I understand it, and as you're keen to stress again this morning, your point is to say, well, why hasn't Darley-Dale been included in the area of search of the sequential test carried out for this application, or certainly as part of the focused area of search? First of all, we can see, can't we, and you've confirmed, Darley-Dale is one step down in the settlement hierarchy. It's a second tier local service centre. You fairly make the point it's the only settlement within that tier. But let's just get a sense, please, of what vision the local plan has strategically for Darley-Dale. Could you go, please, to page 73 of the local plan and to policy HC2?
Yeah, okay.
Are you there? I'm very grateful. So again, a familiar page to us, policy HC2, housing land allocations. This table contains a list of the housing allocations made by the local plan. And can you see that they are broadly organised, aren't they, these housing land allocations by settlement? If we look at the settlement column of that table, we can see that they are organised by settlement alphabetically, yes, starting with Ashbourne, then Brailsford, and then Darley-Dale, yes?
We go down. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You can see that.
Simply since they're only organised alphabetically. They're not organised in any sense of priority. They're organised alphabetically. Yeah,
organised alphabetically by settlement, yes, not by location or site name, by settlement. So we have the allocations for Ashbourne, then the allocations for Brailsford. Then we have the allocations for Darley-Dale. Can you see that?
Yes, indeed.
There are 5 of them in total, aren't there?
Yes.
Yes, there are 5 allocations for Darley-Dale.
Yeah.
I won't spell out all of the locations, but we see that in terms of unit numbers, dwelling numbers, we've got allocations for 57, 9, 135, 20 and 100 units, yes?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, if you tot up rather early in the morning, I know, Mr. Yarwood, to be doing some maths, but if you can tot up or, you know, do some rough arithmetic in your head to get a sense of this, if you tot up the number of dwellings allocated to Darley Dale in that table across those 5 sites, by my calculation, you get to a total of some 321 dwellings, yes?
That's about where I got to, yeah.
Yeah. On sites ranging from 9 units to 135 dwellings, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And we can compare that with the allocation for our site, which is further down the page.
Yeah, well, I'm well aware that those numbers don't add up to your site, but they're the allocated sites.
Yeah.
You're only
Wait for
looking
the
at
question.
allocated sites.
Yeah. Mr. Yarwood, wait for the question and then we'll make progress more efficiently.
I apologise.
No, not at all. The allocation for HC2W, our site, is 430 units, and you've already confirmed that is your understanding.
Yes.
What this table shows is that the sustainable settlement hierarchy for the district in this plan does not, does it, envisage Darley Dale having anything approaching quantum of housing development that is allocated to our appeal site in Matlock, and certainly not anything approaching that on an individual site in Darley Dale. Yes?
I think what this shows is that Darley Dale has been treated exceptionally in comparison to other settlements by being allocated by having sites allocated which are very substantial. And this shows that the hierarchy of Darley Dale is a settlement where substantial housing is appropriate. There may not be many allocations there. That was in part because of the public consultation exercise where the Darley Dale Town Council opposed great amount of development in Darley Dale. But what it shows is that Darley Dale is recognised as a statement which is as a settlement which is suitable for considerable quantity of housing. The allocations don't match those of your site, no. But what does that tell us? It doesn't tell us anything, I don't think. What this table shows, in my opinion, is that Darley Dale is recognised as a settlement which is appropriate for large-scale development.
It tells us an awful lot, I suggest to you, Mr. Yarwood, because planning is all about, or usually about, isn't it, fact and degree. Judgments are made on a spectrum. You say, well, look at these numbers. That shows that substantial, your words, considerable housing numbers have been allocated to Darley Dale in these allocations. And of course, you'd expect, wouldn't you, Darley Dale, if it's a second tier settlement, that the housing numbers allocated to it in these allocations, that it wouldn't be trivial, that it wouldn't be small number. But again, consider those numbers relative, Mr. Yarwood, please, relatively to the allocation that's made for our site at Matlock. Even if you tot up all of these sites in Darley Dale, we are agreed that we only get to 321. We get to 321 in total on the basis of considering 5 allocations that range from 9 units to 135 dwellings. So relatively, as a matter of degree, I'm completely right, aren't I, to say that the settlement hierarchy for the district, as reflected in this table, does not envisage Darley Dale having anything approaching the quantum of housing development that is allocated to our single appeal site in Matlock, yes?
That's correct.
Thank you. So against that background, and keeping this table open, if we may, for now, or at least having the window open in this virtual session, can we turn, please, to your written response to the appellant's sequential test, and this is ID 35. This is the document headed, it's CD 13.7 ID 35, and it's the document headed Response by the Walls Action Group to the Appellant Sequential Test and Answers to the Inspector's Questions, yes?
Yes.
So we'll come back to what you say on the first page, but the body of this response is dealing with the questions that were helpfully posed by the inspector on our sequential test work.
Yeah.
So if you could go to the second page onwards, please. Now, the inspector's first question was about the area of search in the sequential test being limited to Matlock, Wirksworth, and Ashbourne. And you say, in response to this section, if we were minded to include sites, and I quote, as far away as Ashbourne, first paragraph, it would have been logical to include sites in Brailsford, Doveridge, and Holland Ward. So let's just test that. Could you go back, please, to the local plan at page 33, where we find that local plan policy S2, the settlement hierarchy?
Yes, I'm aware of the policy. I don't need to look at it again. Yes, these are much lower tier settlements.
Yeah, okay. But if you need to take it up again and change your mind on that, let me know. But I'm content to ask the question on that basis. Those of us who are looking at policy S2 settlement hierarchy, you're familiar with the policy, as you say. If we go to the third tier within the hierarchy, that is the accessible settlements with some facilities, we will see, won't we, included in that list, those three settlements of Brailsford, Doveridge, and Holland Ward that you mentioned, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And then the paragraph immediately after that heading, again, if you need to go to it, do so. If not, I can remind you of what it says. These villages possess some facilities and services that, together with local employment, provide the best opportunities outside the first and second tier settlements for greater self-containment. They will provide for reduced levels of development in comparison to higher order settlements in order to safeguard and, where possible, improve their role consistent with maintaining or enhancing key environmental attributes. Now, to get an understanding of what those reduced levels of development are, if we go back, please, to page 73 of the local plan and the allocations table in policy HC2. And this I will need you to turn up, if I may, Mr. Yarwood, so that there are some detailed numbers that we need to look at here.
Yes, okay.
I'm very grateful to you. So you've got policy HC2 in front of you, housing land allocations.
Yep.
And again, looking down the table, we can see that there are three allocations made. If we look at Brailsford first, for example, we've got three site allocations there, and they are for 32, 35, and 47 units, respectively. And as you know, there's a note at the end of the table explaining that the numbers 35 and 47 are in brackets with a 0 before them, and there are other similar figures further down in the table. That's reflecting the fact that planning permission has already been given for housing on those sites that's consistent with those allocations, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. But the short point is this: even if we just take the higher numbers for the purposes of this exercise, and I'll remind you they're 32, 35, and 47. The short point is that the local plan clearly does not envisage Brailsford accommodating anything approaching, does it, the quantum of housing allocated on our single site in Matlock of some 430 units, does it?
No, but I fail to see the relevance. But no, I mean, we can go through Holland Ward, Doveridge, and we'll find the same issue. Let's not labour it. I fully accept that these settlements are not envisaged to accommodate the scale of development which is on the appeal side. That's self-evident. Do we need to go through it all?
Forgive me, Mr. Yarwood. Don't worry so much about the questions that are coming. Focus on the questions that I'm putting to you, if I may. With respect to you, it's not my labouring the point. I am picking up on a comment that you made in your proof of evidence or your response on the sequential test issue, where you say, and you're the only one to have raised this point, it would have been logical, you say, to include sites in Brailsford, Doveridge and Holland Ward, as these are settlements where the council has made significant housing allocations. So you're having made that statement, it's appropriate that I test with you whether that would indeed, as you say, have been a logical thing to do. It would not have been a logical thing to do, would it, to test whether Brailsford contains any reasonably available sites for a proposal of in excess of 400 units, when the settlement hierarchy and the strategic vision in this plan is only providing for Brailsford to have unit allocations of circa 30 to at most 50 units, yes?
No, I disagree. The whole point of a sequential test is to look at availability of sites which are sustainable and could meet as an alternative the allocation on the subject site. Now, these sites may not be as sustainable. I think some are, but they may theoretically, because of the hierarchy, not be as sustainable as sites in, say, Matlock or Ashbourne. But if you carry out a sequential test, then providing the sites are relatively sustainable, they should be included. The priority should be given to, well, in my view, the priority should not be given to the main settlements. Priority should be given to the catchment. But if you accept that the whole of the district is the catchment, then certainly the priority should be given to Ashbourne and Wirksworth and Matlock. But in terms of a sequential test, if you haven't got the necessary numbers in those sites, then you would go beyond that to look at other sustainable settlements. So these would not be the priority sites, but they should be included in any proper sequential test.
Sorry to interrupt for a moment, but somebody is banging on the door. So if you could just excuse me for a moment, I'm just going to turn my camera off.
No problem. Thank you, madam.
Apologies for that interruption.
Not at all.
The joys of virtual working.
Indeed, it'll almost certainly happen to me at some point during the day, so I apologise in advance for that.
That's despite
Yarwood.
sign.
Yeah, indeed. Mr. Yarwood, we were having a discussion about sustainability, if you recall, and your point to me, as I understand it, was you were saying, well, look, you can't not have regard to these sites in Darley-Dale and possibly some others in Darley-Dale, because there will be sustainable sites there as well. But the point is a more nuanced one, Mr. Yarwood. It's sustainable for what, isn't it? It's sustainable for what extent of development? And focus on this point that I'm putting to you, please. If we are, as the PPG tells us, to have regard to other relevant local plan policies when we're making judgments about the area of search for the sequential test, having in mind the sustainability objectives of the local plan, it is very clear, isn't it, that when we're talking about sustainability in Darley-Dale, forgive me, in Brailsford, when we're talking about sustainability in Brailsford, what the local plan is envisaging as sustainable in Brailsford are housing sites of circa 30 to 50 units, isn't it? The local plan is not at all envisaging that Brailsford, a third tier settlement, which the local plan in turn says is only capable of accommodating reduced levels of development, it is clearly not, is it, going to be a reasonable area of search for a development proposal of in excess of 400 units, is it?
Well, you don't have to allocate or find sites to allocate all 400 houses on one site. If your area of search is the whole of the district, that gives you lots of opportunity to meet that target of 430 houses on a combination of sites. Once you get out as far as Ashbourne, it really doesn't matter whether it's one site or more than one site, because you're dealing with, you know, a huge catchment, and people therefore aren't focused on all that development being on one site. So I don't see the point. The point is that you need 430 houses. It doesn't have to be on one site.
We're going to come back to the issue of whether we can identify a combination of sites potentially that are reasonably available. But insofar as you're saying, well, look, you know, couldn't Brailsford make some sort of contribution potentially towards a collection or a series of sites delivering in excess of 400 units? The reality here is that if we were to do that in accordance with the vision, the strategic vision in the local plan for Brailsford, as I say, of circa 30 to 50 units at most on sites in that third tier settlement, the contribution that a site in Brailsford could make to that 400 plus development would be roughly 1/8 at most, isn't it? We'd be looking at that's realistically what we'd be looking at if we were really engaged in an exercise of saying, look, can we find a site in Brailsford that can meaningfully contribute to this provision of 400 units? Brailsford would realistically, in accordance with this settlement hierarchy, be able to contribute about 1/8, yes, of that level of provision.
I think you're mixing
at
up
most.
I think you're mixing up hierarchy with allocations. The allocations reflect the hierarchy, but you know, the numbers are the sites that the district council has found in those settlements which it thinks can be allocated. I suspect that in the forthcoming local plan, you will see that Brailsford is allocated vast numbers of housing because there's been a lot of interest in promoting Brailsford as a site for housing. These are the allocated sites. They don't reflect the necessarily available sites that you would look at in a sequential test. I think the point I'm making here is that I don't believe that Brailsford, Ashbourne, Doveridge or Holland are part of the catchment anyway. You know, so this whole exercise has been flawed by, instead of looking at a catchment which reflects what people really want, if they're looking for a site like Gritstone Road in Matlock, they're not going to be looking at Ashbourne, Brailsford, Hull and Ward. You've defined that as the catchment. I disagree. The catchment is Matlock, Darley-Dale and Wirksworth, Tansley. That's the catchment. But if you widen that, as you have, the catchment to the whole of the district, then you look at the whole of the district. And Brailsford is a sustainable settlement and it can make a contribution. It could make a lot bigger contribution than the 100 or so houses that's in the local plan.
Sorry, hundreds or so houses, you say, in the local plan. It isn't, is it? Hundreds or so houses provisioned for Brailsford. It's 3 sites, between circa 30 and 47 units. So we're at a circa 100, aren't we, really? Slightly over units for the whole of Brailsford, yes? So it's not, if I understood you correctly, to say hundreds of units provided for in Brailsford, that's not accurate, is it?
Sorry, if I said hundreds, that wasn't accurate. What I meant was the 100 or so houses in Brailsford.
100 or so, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just complete the exercise by looking at Doveridge as well, please, because you mentioned Doveridge and Holland Ward. Let's take these together because I'm sure you can anticipate the question that's coming. 3 sites in Doveridge. Again, if we ignore the zeros and just take the higher numbers for now as a reflection of the vision that the council had strategically for these settlements, For Doveridge, we have 3 allocations, 46, 85 and 18. And Holland Ward, 48, 18 and 33. Again, it is, with respect to you, Mr. Yarwood, it's pie in the sky, isn't it, to suggest that settlements with allocations for these sorts of numbers would be a reasonable area of search to sequentially test a proposal for over 400 units.
It's pie in the sky to think that somebody who wants a house in Matlock will be looking in Doveridge. But if you say that is the catchment, and you say it's the catchment, I don't, because Doveridge is not a site where somebody wanting a house in Matlock would look to buy a house. But if you say the catchment is the whole of the district, then these 3 villages will make a significant contribution, even on the basis of the allocated sites, to that need. If you look at the actual availability of land there, which could be developed, you get a far higher number. And the fact that they're relatively less sustainable shouldn't exclude them.
Yeah. You understand, don't you, that when we talk about the catchment in relation to the sequential test, we're not just talking about where people would like to live, would they? That might well be a part of the consideration, but even that is a function of something more fundamental, isn't it? When we're talking about the catchment for the purposes of the sequential test, we're talking, aren't we, about what is a reasonable area of search in order to look for reasonably available sites to cater for the same type and broadly the same quantum of development that is being proposed in this particular application. That's fundamentally what we mean by catchment, isn't it? It's not as narrow as just saying, where do people want to live?
It's not as narrow as where do people want to live, but it's not as wide as simply saying, well, it's the whole of the district, because the district has very little relevance, in my view, to catchment. If you're looking at catchment, in reality, you would not look at district boundaries anyway. Somebody wanting or the need for housing in a particular area is calculated by in relation to the district, but it's you can't logically say, in my view, that the catchment is simply the district. That doesn't seem to me logical. The catchment, it seems to me, is the locality, not just where people want to live, but which has a, how could you define it? As PPG recognises, it will be different in different circumstances. My view is simply that the catchment, in reality, is the central part of the district, and if we widen it to the whole of the district, then you include Doveridge and Holland and Brailsford. That's not my strong argument. My argument is that that whole area is not part of the catchment.
Yeah. Just important to clarify this. You do understand, don't you, that it's not our case that the catchment or the reasonable area of search should be the whole district. I think you've described our case in that way a number of times now. You understand, don't you, that it's categorically not our case that the reasonable area of search is the whole of the district. Our case is that the reasonable area of search, it should include the settlements that could conceivably cater for the quantum of development that is being proposed in this application. That's an important clarification, isn't it, and correction of what you've been saying.
If you include Ashbourne in the area of search in the catchment, I don't see the logic in then saying that Holland Ward, for instance, must be excluded. I understand what you say. You're not saying the whole of the district is the catchment. You're saying somehow just the hierarchy, the highest hierarchy of towns is the catchment. Is that what you're saying? So anything between Ashbourne and Wirksworth is outside the catchment. The catchment is 3 towns, disparate towns. I don't see that as logical at all.
Well, we've set out the logic in our evidence. There's a clear difference of opinion between us in relation to that. Can I summarise the difference between us in this way, Mr. Yarwood, from the answers that you've given, and as I've been able to understand them, I hope. The appellant's case is that when it comes to the identifying the catchment or the reasonable area of search, that it is relevant, indeed we'd say important, essential, to have regard to the settlement hierarchy, because that tells us something about the council's vision for where different quanta of development, housing development, should go in the district. As I understand your answers, you've approached the question of catchment very much, haven't you, from the perspective of if people are looking for somewhere to live in Matlock, what is the area of search that they would reasonably be looking at if they were wanting to live in Matlock, and how far out of Matlock would they realistically be willing to go in order to try to find a house in that location? That is, as I understand it, the lens through which you have looked at the sequential test. Is that right?
No, not quite. That's one aspect where people would want to live. But I mean, we've not explored that really in any depth. My attitude to catchment would be, what is the area of demand? Where, you know, where, it's a vague concept, I think, but what ties an area together as an area of homogeneous area for which, you know, you'll be looking to meet a demand? Is that just the whole of the district? Well, there's an argument it is, but my view is that if you're looking at demand for housing, and that's the wider concept than just where people want to live, where the demand for housing, then you wouldn't extend the search to the whole of the district. But if you extend the search to the whole of the district, then you must include the whole of the district and not just the hierarchy, the top hierarchy of towns. That's my position.
I'm grateful. And that, I would suggest to you respectfully, is a misunderstanding of what the sequential approach requires. I'm not suggesting that demand, as you put it, is an irrelevant consideration in the exercise. But if you are primarily concerned, I hope that's a fair summary, if you are primarily concerned with considerations of demand, you are not, are you, undertaking a sequential assessment of the type that is envisaged in policy and guidance, which is that you are searching for reasonably available sites in order to cater for the quantum of the particular type of development that you have in mind. That is the difference between us, isn't it? And your approach, respectfully, is an unduly narrow one, isn't it? Which is not going to lead to a constructive application of that test.
Well, we'll have to disagree. I mean, if the guidance had intended that catchment meant the whole of the district, it would have said so. It wouldn't have used the word catchment. The fact that there's a whole issue over here about catchment suggests something other than the district boundary.
Yeah, well, and as I'll have said, it is not our case that the catchment is the whole of the district, but we don't need to rehearse that again. Just one other point, please, to clarify. In your response to question A, you also mention, we've covered Brailsford, Doveridge and Holland Ward. In the next paragraph, you mention Darley-Dale, and we've already covered Darley-Dale, Middleton by Wirksworth and at Tansley. Now, Middleton by Wirksworth and Tansley, they are again third tier settlements, aren't they, in policy, S2, yes?
Yes.
And if, just for completeness, if we look at the allocations for those in the table, Middleton by Wirksworth, 45 units, and then Tansley, 3 allocations for Tansley of 19, 27 and 49. And
Yep.
again, I would suggest you, respectfully, Mr. Yarwood, it is unrealistic, isn't it, for you to suggest that it would be compatible with the sustainability objectives of this local plan to search for sites in Middleton and Tansley to accommodate a housing development of over 400 units, when these are the sorts of unit numbers that the plan envisages for these settlements.
No, I disagree. You seem to think, or you seem to be proposing, that all these 430 houses must be on one site. I take the view that we're looking for 400 sites to accommodate 430 houses. It doesn't have to be one site, and therefore, you look at the catchment and you find what sites could contribute to that, and it doesn't have to be one site. And if sites in Middleton and Tansley can make a contribution to that need, they should be considered. They're relatively sustainable. Sites in Darley-Dale, as I say, are more sustainable than your site. That's a plain fact. You only have to look at the transport links to know that. So I see little logic in the approach that's been taken.
Yeah, and just to be clear on that, and we'll come back, as I say, to look in more detail at the question of a contribution made by a series or a group of sites. But if we were, for example, to take the Middleton by Wirksworth and what this allocation tells us about the vision that the council has in this plan for Middleton by Wirksworth, that site in Middleton would contribute 1/10, 1/9 at best, wouldn't it, of the level of provision in a 400 plus allocation? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and equally in Tansley, if we look at the sorts of unit numbers here, 19, 27, 49, again, we'd be looking at, wouldn't we, at best, 1/9, 1/10 on some of these sites, even smaller, yes, as a contribution towards a 400 plus allocation, yes?
If you're only looking at allocated sites, yes.
Yeah. The inspector's question B, that's a question about the catchment. I think helpfully, I think we've probably covered that in the exchange that we've already had this morning. Inspector's question C was, does the area of search only include sites within the settlement boundaries of the relevant towns? And your response is yes. And you criticise the table at Appendix 1 to our original sequential test document for discounting sites simply because they were located outside the settlement boundary. Now, before you prepared this response, the response in ID 35, that is, as you know, the appellant had prepared its own detailed response to the same questions. And that is at CD 13.6, if we can go to that. So
I
this
think
is
I have
the
that printed out.
You have it. You have it before you. I'm most grateful. It's the Marin's document response to the inspector's questions, flood risk sequential test ID 26. Yes.
Yes.
Now, if you go to that document, please, and to paragraph 2.14. And 2.14 comes off the back of, and again, just in so that we can orientate ourselves, 2.14 comes within a section answering indeed this question, question C, which comes before 2.12 on the previous page. Does the area of search only include sites within the settlement boundaries of the relevant towns? And it at the end of 2.12, it says that the focus of the area of search in the document was on sites within the settlement boundaries of the first tier settlements. And then 2.13 says, out of an abundance of caution, however, sites adjoining the settlement boundaries of the first tier settlements were also considered and assessed in the sequential test document, insofar as the potential development capacity might be said prima facie to make them suitable for consideration as reasonable alternative sites for the proposal in whole or in part. And it goes on, and then 2.14 refers to this Appendix 1 table that you criticise in your document. Accordingly, as Appendix 1 to the sequential test document records, a number of sites initially considered were outside the defined settlement boundaries of the market towns, but were discounted at an early stage in the assessment. In many cases, these sites were deemed not developable within the Council's 016 or 022 Strategic Housing and Economic Land Availability Assessment. We'll call it the SHILAR from now on, for one or more planning reasons related to landscape, biodiversity and or highway impacts, and therefore discounted on that basis in the sequential test document at an initial stage. The table contained at Appendix 1 has been reproduced and expanded below Table M1 to identify clearly whether the site considered is inside or outside the adopted settlement development boundaries of the market towns, and to refer to any relevant conclusions within the 016 or 022 SHILAR as to the developability of the site. This confirms that the sites outside of settlement limits were initially considered for robustness in the sequential test document. And then we have table M1 reproduced after that. You can see that. And we see there the more detailed information in that table about what the Council's SHILAR work had concluded about the developability. And that's the key point to understand here, isn't it, Mr. Yarwood? The conclusions about developability in this table, they're not the product simply of the appellant's own thinking. The conclusions about developability, they're the products, aren't they, of the Council's own SHILAR work. And you see, don't you, in that table, more information than was provided in the Appendix 1 table. Now, your written evidence does not respond, does it, to the information in this table M1, does it?
No, it doesn't need to.
That's the completeness of your answer in response to that, is it? It doesn't need to engage. Wait for the question. It doesn't need to engage with the more detailed. It's just curious to me because there are other parts of this report, of this document that you've prepared, where you clearly do engage with some of the comments, some of the information provided in this response document. We'll come on later on to the fact that you clearly do engage with table M2, for example, when it comes to totting up the sites in combination. But curiously, you don't comment on other parts of this document, critically this table M1. You comment only and criticise only the earlier version of the table that was superseded by this more detailed table. And you don't comment, do you, on that table?
No, because the original table discounted these sites simply because they were outside the settlement boundary. This further document simply tries to go beyond that. But if you look at the original document, it didn't discount sites for these detailed reasons. They were discounted immediately if they were too small or they were outside the settlement boundary. You tried to put some sort of spin on it by producing a further document which went through all these and gave some other reasons. But the original document, Marin's original document, discounted them simply if they were outside the settlement boundary.
Forgive me, Mr. Yarwood, it's not a matter of putting spin on it, is it? That comes close to suggesting that there's some sort of manipulation in this exercise, and I can assure you that that is not the case. As I've explained to you, what we see in Table 1 is a clear attempt on the part of the appellant to provide more information in relation to these other sites that is founded in the SHILAR conclusions. And as 214 tells us, those SHILAR considerations were undertaken by reference to various planning considerations, and I'll read it out again to you. In many cases, these sites were deemed not developable within the SHLAR for one or more planning reasons related to landscape, biodiversity and or highway impacts, and therefore discounted on that basis. 2 short points. You've confirmed for me, yes, you do not offer any commentary in response to this more detailed table. That you would accept?
No, I don't offer any more detailed commentary.
And could I invite you to retract, if you will, matter for your prerogative, could I invite you to retract, if you will, the comment that this exercise is some sort of spin on the previous table, when, as explained in the document, it is a genuine attempt in good faith, made with the benefit of more time than was available to us when we had to produce the initial sequential test document quickly, because of the late juncture that the point was raised, but we were happy to produce it. You'd accept, wouldn't you, that it wouldn't be fair to characterize this table M1 as an exercise, as you put it, in spin? It's clearly not that, is it?
Well, I apologise for using the word spin. Perhaps that was unfair of me. And I accept as well that the problem which Marans had was they were given very little time to produce the sequential test. However, it would have been, if these were the reasons in the final column why these sites were discounted, that would have been as easy to do in the original document as it was in this document. But if you look at the original document simply discounted these sites because they were outside the settlement boundary. So I didn't feel it was necessary to go to this final column and find other reasons why they'd been discounted. Those reasons weren't given for discounting them initially. They were simply either too small or they were outside the settlement boundary. I could comment on this final column, but it seems to me that the inspector's question was rightly addressed to the original document which was produced by Marans, and that document didn't go into this detail about why sites have been discounted.
No issue at all taken with the question having been asked. It was an entirely appropriate question to be asked, and as you'll have seen, we have been transparent in our evidence about needing to correct certain matters because the initial document had been prepared with some speed. But we can leave it in this way, can't we? That with the benefit of having some more time to produce a more refined document, enabling Marans to set out more fully the rationale that had informed their original assessment, and there being no basis, I suggest to you, to conclude that this is some sort of ex post facto exercise of trying to retrofit another analysis to conclusions previously reached. There's no basis, I suggest to you, for reaching that sort of conclusion. What we do see in this table is a more nuanced picture presented, don't we, in relation to the reasons why those sites, many of those sites listed in that table, were not taken forward to the final analysis, yes?
Yes, it doesn't quite work, does it? Because if you look at this final table, sites which were discounted as wholly unsuited for development in the original table, we now find actually have planning permission. So that rather casts some doubt on whether this level of interest was in the individual sites was shown. The site 2 was shown as not developable, but it's actually got planning permission. And if you look at many other sites, the fact that they were said to be not development in the Schlaw has proved to be unreliable. But that wasn't disclosed in the original Marans assessment of these sites.
You're not suggesting, are you, that as part of the sequential test exercise, that it was necessary for the appellant, in order to produce a robust sequential test assessment, to go beyond the conclusions of the SLA in relation to the lack of developability of those sites, to consider for each of those sites whether there might be a theoretical prospect of their being developed, to taking account of other material considerations, for example, such as the council's lack of 5-year housing land supply. I mean, that would not have been a realistic exercise, would it, to try to look into a crystal ball and decide what conclusions conceivably could the council or a planning inspector on appeal reach in relation to those sites if other material considerations are taken into account. It was legitimate for the purposes of this exercise, wasn't it, to rely on judgments made by this council in relation to developability?
I disagree. I would think in any sequential test which is done thoroughly, it would be necessary to go beyond a simple analysis in the SHLAR that a site was undevelopable. Many of those sites which have been shown to be undevelopable in the SHLAR will be, in my view, allocated in the next local plan. The exercise carried out in the SHLAR is very superficial, and if you're looking at the case of a potential lack of sites, then you would have to go beyond the simple exercise which the council did in terms of the SHLAR. My view is that a proper sequential test would have simply not accepted that because the district council said the site was not developable, that you would discount it. I just disagree.
Can we agree on this at least? When it comes to identifying reasonably available sites, developability is a relevant consideration, isn't it?
Yes, but the fact that the district council said not developable is not sufficient to make that judgment.
Yeah. Let's take it in stages. We agree that when it comes to assessing whether a site is reasonably available, that the developability of that site is relevant. We're agreed on that, yes?
Yes.
Yep. And the best source of information that we have when it comes to the developability of sites generally, considered in this macro way, if you like, for the purposes of this sort of assessment, the best available evidence that we have in a single place in relation to developability is or are the SHLAR documents, isn't it?
Well, yes, on the face of it, but if you were doing a sequential test, I think you'd need to do more than simply make that judgment about developability. I mean, the PPG requires you to look beyond the SHLAR at other sites which might be available. Clearly, you would not know whether they were developable or not. Therefore, you'd have to do an exercise in testing the developability. I think that exercise should be carried out thoroughly in the sequential test. I accept, however, that given the time constraints which were placed on Marans to do this exercise, that probably wasn't possible.
Even if we had all of the time in the world to do the exercise, Mr. Yarwood, there is nothing, is there, in the PPG or any other guidance that says that for the purposes of considering developability in relation to reasonably available sites, that it's not sufficient to have regard to the SHLAR documents that are produced by the council. There's nothing in the PPG, is there, that says that you need to go beyond that sort of evidence. The PPG says in terms that developability is a relevant consideration, and the best macro evidence that we have on developability for the purposes of this sort of assessment is or are the SHLAR documents prepared by the council, yes?
The best available evidence on the face of it without doing further research, yes, but since the PPG guidance suggests you have to look even beyond those sites to other sites on the open market, suggests to me that you have to do a more thorough exercise than that.
Yeah, and indeed, as we'll come on to look at the table, that is precisely what the table did in considering sites that were on the open market, and there's one specifically. We'll come back to that. Inspector's question D, please. Why were sites outside but in proximity to the settlement boundaries of the relevant towns excluded? Again, I think we've covered that. The question was fairly asked and completely understandable, given language that we had used in the original sequential test assessment that failed sufficiently clearly to explain what was being done in Appendix 1 to the table to that document. we've covered, I think, adequately the explanation that we've since provided in our more detailed document after that. So I think we've covered the ground in Appendix D, or rather Question D, adequately. The inspector's question E, and this we have touched on already this morning, was the site assessment methodology in the sequential test consistent with the PPG on smaller sites? Is there a requirement for sites to be linked, was the inspector's question. Now, to be clear, this question refers, doesn't it, to paragraph 28 of the PPG on flood risk and climate change, and the question being, what is a reasonably available site? Again, if I share my screen, I can put that up for you. Hang on, let me just make sure that's open. Right. Here we go. Yes. So if we just go to paragraph 28, can you see that on screen?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. The inspector's question E and this question of combination of sites. What is a reasonably available sites? Reasonably available sites are those in a suitable location for the type of development with a reasonable prospect that the site is available to be developed at the point in time envisaged for the development. This is the key point that I've highlighted yellow. These could include a series of smaller sites and or part of a larger site if these would be capable of accommodating the proposed development. Such lower risk sites do not need to be owned by the applicant to be considered reasonably available. So these could include a series of smaller sites. Now, there is, as I'm sure you'll have noted, Mr. Yarwood, there is very recent case law on this language of a series of smaller sites. And it wouldn't be fair of me to ask you about that case law. That is a matter for submissions in due course. But can I at least clarify this with you? When you answered question A in the inspector's question E, forgive me, in your document, when you answered the question, is there any requirement for such sites to be linked? And you said, we do not see any reason why sites should be linked. Did you base that statement on any court judgment or appeal decision, or were you simply, as I understand it, expressing your opinion?
I was expressing my opinion based on what was said in paragraph 20, 28, is it? No, 20. The paragraph you'd highlighted. I couldn't see any indication in planning policy guidance that the site needed to be linked. I wasn't looking beyond the planning policy guidance.
Yeah. Well, as I say, we have case law now, and there's reference in the case law to relationships between sites and so forth. As I say, that is a matter for submission, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to put case law to you in cross-examination, but I have your clarification as to what that particular statement in your response was based upon. Another point you make in response to question E in the last paragraph of that response, and that's before your response to question F. This relates to table M2 that I touched on earlier in CD 13.6. That being the appellant's response to the inspector's questions. Could you kindly take up that table? I think you're already there.
Yes.
It's in internal page 13 of that document, and it's table M2.
Yep.
And in summary, as I'm sure you've understood, what the appellant has done in that table, I can stop sharing my screen now, I think. What the inspector's done in that table, or what the appellant has done in that table, is to add up the capacities of the smaller developable sites using the information in the more detailed table 1. And the appellant's case is that this exercise shows that even if you tot up all those capacities on the smaller sites, you still wouldn't get anywhere close in any of these settlements to the 400 odd units that are proposed on the appeal site. Now, your response to that is to say, well, the calculation for Matlock is incomplete, you say, because only the capacities for the sites numbered 1, 2, 5, 7, 8, and 10 have been added up. You ask, why hasn't the appellant included the capacities for sites 3, 4, and 6? Well, if I go back to table 1, please, in that document, table M1 in that document, if we take sites 3 and 4 first, please, and you've already made this point, sites 3 and 4 have already been built out, haven't they?
Yes.
They've been fully built out. So there's a simple reason, isn't there, why sites 3 and 4 haven't been included in the calculations in table M2 for Matlock. Because if those sites have already been fully built out for housing, then necessarily they don't have, do they, any remaining capacity for the purpose of the table M2, do they?
I think that's fair. You're right. Yes.
Yeah, and that's fair, isn't it? Because the policy requires us, when conducting the sequential test, to consider reasonably available sites, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, and a site that has been fully built out with housing is not available, is it, for housing development?
That's correct.
I'm grateful. And as for site 6 in the table M1, the simple reason why that site was excluded is because a planning application for housing has been refused on that site, and its capacity therefore identified as 0. So that being so, it wouldn't have been, and we note, yes, an appeal has been lodged, but based on the position as it stands, it wouldn't have been rational, would it, to include site 6 within the calculation of the remaining capacity for housing in table M2, when planning permission for housing had been refused on that site.
Well, I'll accept that. Yes.
Very grateful. The inspector's last question was question F. And the essence of this question, I won't read it all out, but the essence of this question is, have all reasonably available sites been considered? And you say they haven't, and you make a broad statement that, and I quote you, many other sites should have been reviewed, including opportunities for redevelopment of brownfield sites and commercial buildings with potential for conversion. Now, to be clear, that is the extent of the evidence, isn't it, that you've provided on that question of reasonably available sites. You've not provided any written evidence identifying any specific brownfield site or site containing commercial buildings for consideration. Yes? That's
correct.
Yeah. Just a couple of points, please, then, to pick up from the first page of your document. Still with CD 13.7 or ID 35. First, you fairly make the point that in section 4 of our sequential test document, between paragraphs 4.22 and 4.32, that we got the labelling of the 2 quarry sites, which are quite close to each other, and they are Halldale Quarry and Cawdor Quarry. We got the labelling the wrong way round. Now, as you'll have seen, we've since acknowledged that, very happy to correct it. We've corrected it in our written response to your comments at ID 36. The upshot of that, we say, is that it was simply a labelling error, no more than that, and it doesn't change the conclusion of the sequential test that neither sites 2 nor 3 are sequentially preferable to the appeal site based on the analysis in that sequential test document. You understand that based on, I know you disagree with the analysis, but if you simply approach the analysis on its own terms, you accept that error, that labelling error that you've identified does not logically compel, does it, any change in the output of that sequential test?
No, that's absolutely right. It's just an error, a labelling error. It didn't. I was merely pointing it out because it needed pointing out.
No, certainly. And
it doesn't impact on the conclusions. I agree.
I'm very grateful. And let me say again, we're very grateful to you for alerting us to that and giving us an opportunity to ensure that the information was completely correct. Now, one other point to pick up on that page, if I may, first page of your ID 35 document, in the third paragraph, you say that the sequential test document is misleading, your word, misleading, in stating that the corridor quarry site is partially within flood zones 2 and 3. However, as I understand it, and if I read that as a whole, you don't dispute the fact, do you, that parts of the site of that site, as delineated and allocated in the local plan, are within flood zones 2 and 3. Your point is that the allocation, you say, shouldn't have been drawn to include land within flood zones 2 and 3, yes?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So just to be fair to the appellant, that's not the appellant therefore being misleading, is it? That is the appellant relying correctly on the land as allocated in the local plan, yes?
That's fair, yes.
I'm grateful. Now, if we look more closely, please, at the red line of that allocation on page 19 of our sequential test document, which is ID 26. If I can ask you to take that up.
ID 26.
Yes, it's the sequential test document.
Well, the original test.
The original assessment, the original Marin's assessment.
Yeah.
And page 19, please. If it helps, Mr. Yarwood, I can share my screen again. I'm conscious that we're juggling a lot of documents.
No, it's all right. I'll get there. Page 19, did you say?
Page 19, please. Yes, thank you.
Right. Yeah, page 19. I've got that. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Are you? It's very helpful if you are, in fact, looking at it electronically. Are you looking at it electronically?
I am, yes.
Could I invite you to, I mean, I think you can do it without zooming in, but it's even more helpful, I think, if you could just zoom in, please, on the map at the top of page 19, which shows the quarry site that we're discussing here.
Yep.
Because if you zoom in, if you look closely at the red line of that allocation on page 19, your statement in your written response that the allocation, and you say, strays into the middle of the River Derwent and thus into flood zones 2 and 3. It's wrong, isn't it, insofar as you're saying that it strays into the middle of the River Derwent. As I see the red line of the allocation stray into the middle of the River Derwent, does it? It certainly overlaps with an area with and we can see it there clearly, a flood zone 2 area and some small sections of flood zone 3. But it's not right, is it, to say that the red line strays right into the middle of the river?
No, you're right. You're right.
I'm grateful for that. We're agreed that the River Derwent is entirely, the River Derwent itself is entirely outside, isn't it, the red line to the north of that red line.
Yeah, that is correct, yes.
Mr. Yarwood, let me just check my messages just in case there's anything has cropped up. No, there isn't anything. Mr. Yarwood, those are my questions for you on the sequential test. I'm most grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Yarwood. So just before we take a break, can I just check whether there's any questions of Mr. Yarwood from anybody supporting the appeal? No, I don't have any further questions. Thank you. So now seems a good time to take a break. We're running about 15 minutes behind the timetable, but everybody happy to reconvene at 11:30?
Yes.
Okay.
Certainly.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Yarwood, for your time in cross-examination, and we are adjourned till 11:30. See you all soon.
Thank you, Madam.
Cheers. Hello everyone. The time is 11:30 and the inquiry is resumed. Thank you. You can see screens pinging back into use. Mr. Lewis, are you ready to introduce the appellant's sequential test witness, Mr. Pendle, and his evidence?
I am indeed, Madam. I will, and I can see Mr. Pendle's already joined us on screen. Mr. Pendle, very good morning to you. I should say before we start with Mr. Pendle, Madam, you have in our updated list of appearances Mr. Pendle's academic qualifications and his professional memberships. That is in the updated list of appearances in ID 39. However, because of the documents from Marrons having been prepared essentially as documents by the consultancy and not proofs per se, you don't have the usual paragraph setting out Mr. Pendle's relevant experience and expertise and so on. So we will remedy that after today, indeed in the course of today, I'm sure, and ensure that that is emailed to you so that you've got a fuller account of his relevant experience and expertise. But as I say, his academic qualifications are recorded in that updated list.
Okay, thank you for that. Good morning, Mr. Pendle.
Good morning, Ma'am.
Mr. Pendle, could we just start with that? Because yes, you've told us that you have a BA Honours degree. Could you just elaborate, please, on your relevant qualifications, your relevant experience that you say equips you well to assist us with this issue today?
But by all means, sir. I'll say good morning again, Mom, because I said it on mute, so forgive me for that. Yes, my name's David Pendle. I hold a BA Honours degree in town planning from Sheffield Hallam University. I graduated in 1997. I then graduated my second degree, a Bachelor in Town Planning degree from the university, from Sheffield Hallam University and Ryerson University in Toronto in 1998. I became a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute in 2000, 2 years post-qualification experience. So I have around, I think, 27 years of practice to date. I worked essentially in local government until 2019. So the first 3 quarters, I'll do a quick calculation, was in local government. The vast majority of that was in strategic planning, writing, authoring local plans, but I've also worked in development management, and I've also, for my sins, undertaken a bit of enforcement through that career. In 2019, I joined Marrons, a private sector consultant. As of today, I'm a partner in the firm, and I have experience, as you might expect, undertaking sequential test and effectively critiquing as well sequential test work, both for local plan examinations and for development management proposals.
Pendle, thank you very much. And as I say, we will record that in writing also for the inquiry's benefit. Mr. Pendle, 3 documents, please, that we're going to focus upon in this examination in chief, and you'll be familiar with them. It's the sequential test document itself. That's ID 26. We've got the appellant's response to the inspector's questions. That's ID 33 or CD 13.6. And then we've got the appellant's response to the Rule 6 parties' comments on our response to the inspector's questions, and that's ID 36. Can you confirm, Mr. Pendle, that you were involved in the preparation of all of those documents?
I can.
Yes. And can you confirm that, as I understand it, you adopt the contents of those 3 documents as your evidence, subject, of course, to some corrections that we've made within those documents as the work has gone on? Yes?
I do.
Yeah. Before we look at the detail, Mr. Pendle, can you explain to the inquiry how you and Marrons came to be asked to prepare the sequential test document in this case, and some of the particular time constraints that you're operating under in relation to that first piece of work in particular?
Of course, by all means. As I understand, just the question of a sequential test on this appeal was raised, my language, Ma'am, at a relatively late juncture, and the inquiry was about to sit, and there was around a week to put together the sequential test document itself, ID26, which is now ID26. A week to prepare that type of evidence is a considerable constraint on that type of activity. We were able to undertake clearly the document that you've seen in front of you within that time period by working on office hours, as you might expect. Notwithstanding the very quick time that it's been put together, and you haven't asked me this question, sir, Mr. Lewis, but I will say it. I'm comfortable that it's a robust and proportionate piece of evidence within that time constraint.
I'm going to take the contents of the sequential test document largely as read, Mr. Pendle, and I'm going to use the inspector's questions on that document as a framework for the questions that I'm going to ask you. And so to that end, I'm going to focus, please, on the document setting out your responses to the inspector's questions, and that is CD 13.6, the response to the inspector's questions on the flood risk assessment. If you could kindly go to that.
Ready, sir.
I'm very grateful. So you'll see within that document that you'll be very familiar with this document. 2 of the document contains your responses to the inspector's questions. Question A, as we know, we touched on it with Mr. Yarwood this morning, was in relation to the limitation of the area of search for the sequential test to Matlock, Wirksworth and Ashbourne. And in essence, you say in paragraph 2.1, you draw our attention to paragraph 23 of the PPG, and the reference there to the need for compatibility with sustainable development objectives when you are ascertaining the extent of the sequential approach exercise to be undertaken and the nature of it. In 2.2, you cite again from the PPG and the need to apply the test by reference to local circumstances relating to the catchment area for the type of development proposed, which, and you quote, may be identified from other plan policies. And then at 2.3, one of the key development plan policies in the local plan that you identify as relevant to that exercise is policy S2 of the local plan. Now, Mr. Pendle, you'll have heard what the Rule 6 party says in response to this. And I should say at the outset, of course, the council does not take issue with the approach that we have taken, but the Rule 6 party does. The Rule 6 party says that this was the wrong approach to take. It was wrong, they say, to take as our area of search the market towns within that first tier, and that if we were going to extend the reasonable area of search outside of Matlock, then we should have included sites in the lower tier settlements, including Darley Dale in the second tier. Let's just focus on Darley Dale to begin with, and you deal with Darley Dale at paragraph 2.6 of that response. Can you summarise for us why you did not include Darley Dale within that focused area of search, and why you limited it to those market towns?
Of course, by all means. Paragraph 23 of the PPG instructs us to undertake the sequential test, steer development to the lowest areas at risk of flooding, where it is compatible with sustainable development objectives to do so. We operate within a plan-led system, not a vacuum. The expression of sustainable development objectives for Darley Dale is prescribed by the adopted local plan, the statutory development framework. Policy S2 of that adopted local plan sets the primary focus for growth, and I'm paraphrasing now, I've not got it in front of me, but sets as the primary focus for growth the 3 market towns within Tier 1. And in doing so, and I know you ran through this with Mr. Yarwood, it then has a sort of distribution, a cascade, where it then looks to the second tier, of which Darley Dale is again, I'm paraphrasing, a collection of smaller settlements. But the primary focus, the sustainable development objective, is for primary growth to be directed towards the market towns.
Very grateful. And you'll have heard what Mr. Yarwood said this morning about, well, he really questioned our approach to the catchment, and I put it to him that, that our approach to the catchment was premised on our judgment as to what the reasonable area of search would be. And you'll recall Mr. Yarwood's answer was along the lines of saying, well, look, if you're really looking at the catchment and you're looking at issues of demand of where people want to live in or around Matlock, then necessarily you would have expanded the area of search beyond Matlock to include some of the lower tier settlements around Matlock. What's your response to that, and whether that would have been a reasonable or unreasonable, correct or incorrect approach to take to the sequential test?
I'll try to be generous when I give this answer. I don't think it's reasonable. The expression, the policy framework we have set by policy S2, and I'll touch on S3 and S5 in doing this, and then the basket of allocations that exist under HC2 are clear that development of this scale should be directed towards the top tier, the tier 1 market towns. The application of para 23 and then 27 of the PPG instructs us to have regard to those sustainable development objectives. It would be odd to step outside of that development framework, in my view.
Thank you. I'm grateful. Let's move on to question C, please, because we've covered, I think, the essence of what question B was asking. Question C from the inspector was, does the area of search only include sites within the settlement boundaries of the relevant towns? And you answer this in the subsequent paragraphs. And again, to summarise, you say in 213, out of an abundance of caution, sites adjoining the settlement boundaries of the first tier settlements were also considered and assessed in the sequential test document, insofar as their potential development capacity might be said prima facie to make them suitable for consideration as reasonable alternative sites for the proposal in whole or in part. And you go on to say that you did that as a further check within the sequential test document for robustness. And then 2.14, you expand on that by reference to Appendix 1 to the sequential test documents. And then you explain that in many cases, the sites that were deemed not developable within that Appendix 1 table were deemed not developable on the basis of the Council's 2016 or 2022 Shalar documents for one or more planning reasons related to landscape biodiversity and or highways impacts, and therefore discounted on that basis in the ST document at initial stage. A table contained in Appendix 1 has been reproduced and expanded below Table M1 to identify clearly whether the site considered as inside or outside the adopted settlement boundaries of the market towns, and to refer to any relevant conclusions within the Shalar documents as to the developability of the site. This confirms, you say, that sites outside of settlement limits were initially considered for robustness in the sequential test document. Can you summarise for us, Mr. Pendle, why you prepared this Table M1 document, this Table M1, and what this Table M1 is showing?
Of course, but by all means. I'll start by saying the behaviour that we've adopted in preparing the sequential test is to be open, transparent, and cautious. You've quite correctly referred to the abundance of caution that we've talked about in this document. The scope that we set had reference to the policy framework. I've already mentioned that. We know that policy S5 directs development within settlement limits. What we didn't want to do and what we could not do was be entirely closed to the notion that there was a sequentially preferable alternative site that was developable, which was capable in whole or in part of contributing towards meeting these needs in an area at lower risk of flooding. So we were entirely open to the notion of that search for alternative sites. And what Table M1 does, the original listed the sites, obviously, and showed the sites that we had awareness of. Again, being open, fully in the knowledge that there are other parties participating in this inquiry who may wish to tell us we've missed something. So we've shown beneath the bonnet the sites that we've looked at and considered. Table M1 in ID 33 adds a layer of detail to the original table M1 in ID 26, and shows by source what the Sheila outcome was with regards to whether or not it's developable or not, because that's material here, and whether or not it was inside or outside of the settlement limit, because that's also material having regard to policy S5 and what paragraphs 23 and 27 of the PPG tell us to do in pursuing a sequential test approach.
Thank you, Mr. Pendle. And you will have heard that one of the suggestions made by Mr. Yarwood, and in fairness to him, he did qualify his answer somewhat in the course of our exchange, but there was some concern, let's say, I'll describe it neutrally. There was some concern expressed as to whether this table M1 was in some way an exercise in trying to find some other justification for the judgments that had been made in the original Appendix 1 table. What is your response to that concern insofar as it's expressed?
Table M1 shows evidence. It doesn't show planning. There's no planning judgment on behalf of myself or Marans in Table M1. Whether or not the site is inside or outside of settlement boundaries prescribed by the adopted development plan, and the Sheila outcome is an outcome that's prescribed within the Sheila itself, evidence produced by Derbyshire Dales District Council. So Table M1 has no planning judgment in it. It doesn't contain any opinion from myself. So I can't really understand the comment that it was trying to somehow, I can't remember the exact word Mr. Yarwood used, spin, I believe it was, that he's trying to put some spin on it. It's presenting evidence.
Indeed, and in fairness to him, he did qualify that answer subsequently, and we were grateful for that. But fair to say, I think that there was some concern expressed about this. And apologies, I interrupted you. You were completing your answer.
No. I finished, sir.
I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful. Another concern raised by Mr. Yarwood, Mr. Pendle, was to say, well, all very well to look at the Sheila evidence, but we really should have gone further and not limited our consideration, he suggests, to the Sheila when it came to considerations of developability. What's your response to that in the context of the type of assessment you were undertaking here?
It's entirely normal. I mean, I've already used the word proportionate. It's entirely normal when looking for reasonable, available alternatives to use what would be considered the primary route evidence for a district for availability, which is a Sheila. Its very purpose is to arrive at conclusions as to whether or not sites are available, having regard to the definition of availability in the PPG. Whether or not we should then extend beyond that, I suppose, without asking a question back of Mr. Yarwood, would be, what do we do? Is that start to, there's been a comment made about the boundary of one of the allocations, for example, and comments within Mr. Yarwood's submission about the developable area within a site, for argument's sake. Are we to undertake constraints-led exercise for every and any parcel of land and try and understand whether or not there are developable components, for example, rather than rely on the Sheila's strategic view of developability? I would suggest that would be quite odd in the context of performing and undertaking a sequential test. Not something that we would do. And we certainly wouldn't go out and do constraints-led exercise and then design against it for the sites to understand whether or not there were components of sites that could come forwards and debunk the council's evidence.
Thank you. Question E, Mr. Pendle, please, of the inspector's questions. This was the issue in relation to combinations of sites, as you'll recall. The question was the site assessment methodology in the sequential test consistent with the PPG in terms of smaller sites? Is there any requirement for such sites to be linked? And I've already covered this morning the exercise that you then undertook in table M2. Could you summarise for us why you carried out this exercise in table M2 and what it shows us?
But by all means, thank you, sir. I mean, I'll give a little bit of context for this, if I may. In the PPG, paragraph 27, I think it is, or it's 28 that deals with the 28 deals with the this issue. And I'll well, I won't paraphrase. I'll read from it, but I appreciate it's not on the screen as it was before. What is a reasonably available site? These could include a series of smaller sites, and the word I would just pause on there is a series. What does that mean? And I'm aware a matter for you, or a matter you will pick up, sir, in closing about Mead Realisations case and this idea of a relationship. It can't be the case that you would simply tot up all of the available smaller sites and say, is that sufficient? That isn't what para 28 of the PPG tells you to do. It talks about a series of sites, and Mead talks about there being some form of relationship. So what we tried to do, legitimately so, I think, and again, openness, transparency, was consider whether or not there were sufficient smaller sites taken in series under para 28 in one of the three larger market towns to perform the function of having numerically enough and sufficient space to accommodate the strategic development that we have here, the appeal proposal. What you can see in table M2 is that in none of the three towns is there sufficient quantum of development on smaller sites. And I'll stress that's before we've posed the question of how those smaller sites are linked, the series, the relationship moment. We haven't posed that question in there beyond, are they in the top tier? There is insufficient capacity. So what M2 was doing, again, was showing that we were open to the idea that the development that we're proposed here through the appeal proposals had to be looked at in accordance with para 28 to see if there was a series of smaller sites that we could disaggregate to. And M2 shows that that's not possible.
Question F, Mr. Pendle, the inspector's final question. Again, overlaps with the discussion we've been having, but let's deal with it for completeness. PPG confirms that reasonably available sites are those in a suitable location for the type of development with a reasonable prospect that the site is available to be developed at the point in time envisaged for the development. Have all reasonably available sites been fully considered? And you respond in paragraph 34 to say that you are satisfied for the reasons that you've given in this paper, that the sequential test document has given due consideration to all reasonably available sites based on those criteria that you mentioned there. Does this remain your view, Mr. Pendle, in the light of all of the information that has now been provided by all parties in relation to this issue?
That does indeed remain my view, sir, yes.
And specifically, have you seen anything in the evidence provided by the Rule 6 party, who is leading the charge in resisting the approach that we've taken in the sequential test document? Have you seen anything submitted by the Rule 6 party that suggests to you that there was a significant omission in the sequential test analysis that you undertook?
No, I have seen no suggestion of any sites that we failed to consider. You've already quite rightly made the point that the need for the correction in ID 26 was raised by the Rule 6 party. I would have hoped we've been open, transparent, and shown all of the sites that we've looked at, including Table M1 that we've just run through, and I have not seen any other site suggested to us that we have missed, either large, small, or other.
I'm grateful. And last question from me, Mr. Pendle. The main product of the sequential test work that you undertook is the corrected tables in your response to the Rule 6 party's comments on your sequential test assessment. If we could go to ID 36, please, which has been the last document that you have prepared on this issue. And you'll see that on page 3 of that document, we have table 5.1 and table 5.2 over the page with the labelling in relation to sites 2 and 3 corrected. In summary, Mr. Pendle, what do you invite the inquiry to take away from these tables?
Well, probably only two things, sir. The first one is an apology that we confused the titles. That was an outcome of the speed and pace that this was produced at, and again, as you've said, helpful that it was pointed out. We were happy to correct it. That's the first point, and it's right for me to say that. Second point I'll say is that in making those amendments, there is no material change or difference to the outcome of the sequential preference, the outcome of the test itself, which is that the appeal site 1, land at Gritstone Road, Matlock, remains ranked first in sequential priority order. Sites 2 and 3, the product of flipping those titles around is that the one that was suggested to be number 5 is now number 3, and the one that was suggested to be number 3 is now number 5.
Mr. Pendle, those are all my questions for you. Is there anything else that you wish to say about this issue before you answer questions? There might not be, but just giving the opportunity just in case there is anything.
Thank you, sir. No, nothing further from me.
Thank you. Madam, those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Yarwood, are you ready to cross-examine Mr. Pendle?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Over to you.
Mr. Pendle, you acknowledge that 1 week was a very difficult constraint in order to produce this document. What more would have been possible had you had more time? Or do you think that it would have still been the same had you had more time? Was the constraint a real limitation on what you could achieve?
I'm going to try not to be flippant when I say this, Mr. Yarwood. The difficulty in doing it in that time ostensibly was one of family matters. A week, you've seen the product and the outcome. There was the error in the site titles, and we have since felt it helpful to reproduce Table M1 and provide some additional context. Those two matters, I think, would have been picked up, and we would have been comfortable in dealing with those had we have had further time. And of course, within the context of this inquiry, we have had time to do that. Been grateful for you pointing out the first of those two issues to us. So on that basis, no, I don't think we would have found anything different. I certainly don't think we would have found any other sites. And of course, you've just heard under my evidence in chief, I was asked the question of whether or not any other sites have been put forward to us through this inquiry process, and they haven't. So no, I'm quite comfortable with ID 26 as corrected.
Right, when you say as corrected, do you regard the additional of comments in the table of sites as a correction, or is that simply additional information that you've been able to provide subsequently?
Let me change my use of the word corrected to amended. I mean, it's certainly a correction in the sense of the two titles. It'd be odd of me to suggest that's not a correction. Table M1, as you've already heard me say, reproduces evidence. We haven't corrected that in that sense. So, you know, I was quite wrong to use that term. Table M1 is simply showing things that were known to us at the time we produced ID 26, the original sequential test document itself, but we didn't include them. We didn't put them in the table. And we have since considered it helpful to put it in the table, bearing in mind some of the questions that have been raised on the document itself.
Do you think it was adequate in the original table simply to discount sites either because they were outside the settlement boundary or because they were too small, which was the implication on that table?
Well, first of all, we didn't simply discount them because they were outside the settlement boundary or too small. And you've heard me talk about being open, transparent, and cautious. We considered them, and we considered their developability, and we considered how the development framework, the policy framework, would consider those sites. And again, you've heard me say this already, expressly having regard to paragraphs 23 and 27 and 28 of the PPG. So I don't think it's fair to say that we simply rejected them because they were outside of the settlement boundary, and that we have since tried to change that to suggest we did something different.
Because if sites were simply excluded because they were outside the settlement boundary, that would have been the case of the appeal site, wouldn't it? Because that would have been outside the settlement boundary had it not been allocated. It was only within the settlement boundary because it was an allocation. In other words, the test for whether something was in the settlement boundary was whether it had already been allocated.
I suppose that you're suggesting, I don't know, forgive me, correct me if I'm wrong, you're suggesting there in your question that I somehow don't have regard to sustainable objectives under para 23, and I don't have regard to the fact the site is allocated and is within the settlement limit. It's both those things, and paragraph 23 suggests that we should take that into account. So I'm not sure, unless I've missed the point, I'm not sure I follow.
Let's just look at this.
Are you asking me to turn my back on the local plan?
No, I'm not asking you to do any such thing. I'm asking you to confirm that had the appeal site not been an allocated site, it too would have been outside the settlement boundary.
Well, it would, yes, correct, but so would the other 5 sites in table 5.1.
Yeah. So if you had simply excluded sites because they were outside the settlement boundary, it would have been a self-fulfilling prophecy, wouldn't it? Because the appeal site would have been the same.
It would have fundamentally changed the outcome from what could be considered a reasonable alternative site. And I would suggest in a development plan-led system, we wouldn't necessarily just be wrestling with the prospects of this allocated site coming forwards through a sequential test approach. Anywhere could.
Let's move on to the issue of what sites can be regarded as sustainable. Paragraph 23 of the PPG says that development should be considered where it is compatible with sustainable development objectives to do so. That's correct, isn't it? So if we then look at the local plan in relation to Darley Dale, as you say in your paragraph 2.6, the local plan describes Darley Dale as having the ability to support sustainable patterns of living. Does that not indicate that Darley Dale complies with the requirement in paragraph PPG 23?
You'll forgive me, Mr. Yard. I'm just going to go to policy S2. It isn't. Hang on a second. I think I've got there. So policy S2, to be taken, read the local plan as a whole. The line that you've just referred to sits within a hierarchy. So when we're invited to think about sustainable development objectives, I say invited, I should again say instructed to do so within the PPG, you have to take the policy as a whole. And what it does there, and you referred to this in your cross-examination, you referred to primarily development should be directed towards the market towns. The word you used was primarily, primacy. Indeed, policy S2, very similar language, the market towns are the primary focus for growth and development. For Darley Dale, which is a second tier, it does not say that Darley Dale is the primary focus for growth and development. Now, you could infer that means it possibly secondary. It is indeed the second tier. It doesn't talk about growth and development. It talks about the ability of Darley Dale to support sustainable patterns of living. That's something quite different, I would suggest, to what that policy is saying about the market towns. They are the primary focus for growth, and indeed the expression of that you can find in policy HC2 in the manner in which development is then distributed against that settlement hierarchy and allocated. So no, I would disagree with the point that you're making, that it is, I don't know what, again, we put words in your mouth, that it's either that Darley Dale is either somehow equal to the top tier market towns, or actually primary to the market towns, because by very virtue of the policy it can't be.
I'm not suggesting that. What I'm asking you to comment on is whether Darley Dale, which is acknowledged to support sustainable patterns of living in the local plan, whether that can be said to comply with paragraph 23 of PPG, which says where it is compatible with sustainable development objectives. We don't have to rely, do we, on the priority of tier 1 settlements to look at what is sustainable, because the local plan, does it not, acknowledges that Darley Dale can be regarded as providing sustainable patterns of living, and therefore shouldn't you have included Darley Dale?
No, I don't think we should have included Darley Dale as the second tier settlement. And my reading, you know, if we take the paragraph about Darley Dale just in isolation for a moment, the ability to support sustainable patterns of living, it doesn't say primary focus for growth. It then, when it talks about in the second half, the second sentence of that paragraph, the ability to provide for additional jobs and homes, in order to, there are qualifying statements in there, in order to help sustain and where necessary enhance current services and facilities, promoting better levels of self-containment and a viable sustainable community. Now, those qualifying statements there have led the council to direct development in such a pattern that they did not consider in the adopted development plan. This is their planning judgment, not mine. I'm not laying planning judgment on this. They did not consider Darley Dale capable of accommodating this level of growth that we're concerned with in this appeal. So I would suggest that in terms of sustainable development, it's not simply the case that it's a flat hierarchy, where because it says sustainable living, that means by virtue of that higher levels of growth, larger scale development should somehow be directed to Darley Dale. And indeed, if the authority had have meant that, it definitely, well, I'll qualify this by saying this plan should not have been found sound, and it has been found sound. It shouldn't have talked about the top tier being the primary focus for growth, because by virtue of your line of questioning, Darley Dale is somehow equal to the top tier, and it isn't.
Do you not accept that in looking at sequential sites for development, if you don't find sites in the highest tier, you look to the second tier?
We did find sites in the highest tier.
No, that's not the question I asked. I said, if you don't find sites in the highest tier, would you look for sites in the second tier?
If we didn't find sites in the highest tier, would we move to the second tier? Possibly. but we didn't. That isn't the case. We're dealing with an abstract notion. We found sites in the highest tier in accordance with the sustainable objectives for the district set by, instructed to do so by Para 23 of the PPG, and that framework, that spatial framework set by the adopted development plan.
But the sites you found in tier 1 were subject, or at least some of them were subject to flood risk. Therefore, would you not move to tier 2?
We could do if paragraph 23 of the PPG didn't tell us to take into account sustainable development objectives.
But we've already acknowledged.
But it does.
But the fact that a site is in tier 2 does not mean it's unsustainable, because tier 2 settlement, well, the tier 2 settlement was judged to be sustainable. Is that not the case?
I think you're sharing your planning judgment on the development framework, the policy framework. I think you're sharing your judgment on that with me. I've already shared mine. No, I don't think you would go to the second tier in order to test those against the first tier for this level of growth. You know, the catchment area for this level of growth is the top tier settlements.
Can I ask whether, in regard to PPG paragraph 28, which says that you shouldn't simply rely on local authority site allocations or land availability assessments, but you should go beyond that to look at other sites. Did you go beyond that and look at other sites?
Sorry, could you point me, please, to paragraph 28 where it says
28. Halfway down the first paragraph of 28. Sorry, maybe talking about 29. I've not got the numbering. But let me quote: the applicant will need to identify whether there are any other reasonably available sites within the area of search that have housing or have not already been identified by the planning authority in site allocations or relevant housing and land availability assessments. It asks you to go beyond that in looking for sites. And did you do so?
Yes, yeah, we did do that. But forgive me, it is paragraph 29, not 28. The example they give in 29 is such as sites currently available on the open market. And if I just, you'll forgive me for not being dexterous enough to do this swiftly, go back to table M1, and I'll go to table M1 in ID 33, site 49. Site 49 is an example of where we've done exactly that and had a look at a site that was available on the open market, clearly large, you know, a reasonable target for us in terms of the caution that we're exercising, and we looked at it. Now it's outside the settlement limit. It's also not assessed in the SHELAR. It's also not attached to a tier 1 market town. Nevertheless, in accordance with paragraph 28, and actually by coincidence, the very example they tell you to look for, we have that with site 49.
Did you?
Now, there were no others. I should stress, we haven't just included one and there were abundance of others. There were no others, and forgive me, I don't think you've suggested to us that there are any others.
No, I was simply asking the question. Did you feel it necessary to look at brownfield sites which had not been allocated?
We were wholly open to the idea of looking at other sites, and we did not find any reasonable alternative available sites that needed to be shown either in table M1 or indeed drawn up into the assessment itself.
I don't think I've got any more questions, Inspector.
Thank you, Mr. Yarwood.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yarwood. Can I ask whether there's any questions for Mr. Pendle from any interested parties who are objecting to the proposed development?
Could I ask a question, Madam? Is John Ashby?
Yes, Mr. Ashby, go ahead.
Mr. Pendle, what is your view as it's transpired, of the actual planning has resulted in 0 affordable housing planned for these 430 homes. You keep saying you're meeting a need. The
Mr.
need as
Ashby,
set out by the government is for affordable homes, and the standard, after a lot of deliberation, was 30%.
Mr. Ashby, you can ask questions of Mr. Pendle in relation to the sequential test, which is the work he has undertaken. The discussion of affordable housing has already taken place in this inquiry, and you may wish to ask a question of Mr. Dickinson later, but it would not be appropriate to ask this question of Mr. Pendle.
Okay, I apologise.
Okay, thank you. Anything from you, Mr. Lewis?
Madam, I just wanted to point out that on my screen, the raise hand function has been disabled, just in case someone is wanting to
Trying
speak
desperately to raise their hand.
and is
Okay.
unable to do that. So either, I don't know if the council's in a position to activate that, if it's the same for other people, but those wishing to speak might need to say something rather than rely on the raise hand function.
Yeah, well, Mr. Ashby got in there first, and people can do the same as Mr. Ashby if they do have any questions on the sequential test. No?
No, madam.
Okay. Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Mr. Lewis, would you like to re-examine Mr. Pendle?
I don't have any re-examination, madam. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Okay, so we are now at 12:15. So that's been quite a bit quicker than anticipated. Thank you very much. What's the feeling on breaking for lunch now and coming back for planning evidence after lunch, or would people like to make a start on planning evidence? Any views? Can I start with Mr. Yarwood?
I've no strong views either way. Would seem reasonably convenient to break for lunch now,
Okay.
and we can crack on it this afternoon as quickly as possible.
Okay. Any views from the council?
No views from me. Thank you, madam, for asking.
Okay, Mr. Lewis.
I'm happy to go along with Mr. Yarwood's slight preference for a break. If we're to have a break, madam, and we clearly do need a break at some point, this would seem the most logical point to have one.
Okay, everybody happy with breaking till 1:15 then?
Certainly.
Okay. So thank you everybody very much for your participation this morning. The inquiry is adjourned until 1:15. I'll see you back there then. Thank you.
Thank you. Get in.
Hello, good afternoon. The time is 1:15 and the inquiry is resumed. Hello, Mr. Yarwood, Mr. Lewis.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Good afternoon and good afternoon. Okay, so we've now finished with the sequential test evidence and we're moving on to planning. Mr. Lewis, would you like to cross-examine Mr. Yarwood on planning, please?
Yes, certainly, Madam. Thank you. Mr. Yarwood, good afternoon again.
Hello there.
Hello there. This section of the cross-examination is intended to deal with the planning balance, but just so that we can be clear about the scope of what I have to ask you, Mr. Yarwood, I've read your proof of evidence again for the purposes of today. It is correct, isn't it, to say that in your proof of evidence on behalf of the World Action Group, a document familiar to us, you don't actually provide any evidence in relation to the planning balance per se, do you?
That is correct.
Yes. As you signal in paragraph 1.4 of your evidence, your proof contains evidence and commentary in relation to the specific issues of, and you go through the list and they're familiar to us, land drainage and flood risk, biodiversity, character and appearance of the area, highway and pedestrian safety, provision of affordable housing, and financial contributions towards community and infrastructure needs. And if we work through your proof, you'll be familiar with it, of course. If we work through your proof follows that order of issues faithfully, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yep. So we have land drainage at your section 2. Section 3 is biodiversity. Section 4 is character and appearance. Section 5 is highway and pedestrian safety. Section 6 is affordable housing. Section 7 is financial contributions. Yes?
Yes.
Now, all of those issues I cross-examined upon, or in relation to section 7 was the subject of a roundtable discussion. But we've covered those matters on the last occasion, so I don't need to repeat the exercise of asking you questions about those sections again. And so the proof ends, doesn't it, somewhat abruptly, I suggest to you respectfully, with that section 7 on financial contributions, doesn't it? You tell us what you want to say about financial contributions and then that's it, yes?
That's the final section of my report, my proof, yes.
Indeed. And the difficulty with that, I suggest to you, is that there is no attempt made, therefore, is there, either after that or certainly not within the body of the proof, to look at all the material planning considerations globally and to undertake a plan